Most people have been afraid of saturated fat for decades. Butter, eggs, red meat, all labeled as silent killers. But what if the story you've been told is incomplete, or even wrong? What if the very nutrient blamed for heart disease was never the real enemy, and the newest science quietly proves it? For years, saturated fat has been treated like a villain. Doctors warned against it. Food labels screamed low fat. Supermarkets filled with margarine, vegetable oils, and fat-free snacks. And people followed the advice faithfully. Yet, during the same period, heart disease didn't disappear. Obesity exploded. Diabetes skyrocketed. Something didn't add up. To understand why, we have to go back to how this fear started. In the 1950s, a theory emerged suggesting that saturated fat raised cholesterol and higher cholesterol caused heart disease. It sounded logical. Early studies seemed to support it. Governments reacted quickly. Dietary guidelines were created, warning people to limit saturated fat as much as possible. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Those early studies were not as solid as people believed. Many were observational. Some ignored conflicting data. Others lumped all saturated fats together as if they were identical. And once the guidelines were in place, questioning them became almost impossible. Fast forward to today. Scientists now have access to massive data sets, better statistical tools, and decades of follow-up data. That's where meta-analyses come in. A meta-analysis doesn't rely on one small study. It combines results from dozens, sometimes hundreds of studies, analyzing outcomes across millions of people. And this is where things get interesting. In multiple large modern meta-analyses, researchers found something shocking. Saturated fat intake by itself was not consistently associated with increased risk of heart disease. In other words, eating saturated fat did not automatically translate to more heart attacks or shorter lifespans. That doesn't mean saturated fat is a but it does mean the simplistic idea saturated fat equals heart disease doesn't hold up under deeper scientific scrutiny. So why did cholesterol get dragged into this mess? Saturated fat does tend to raise LDL cholesterol, often labeled bad cholesterol. But LDL is not one single thing. There are different particle sizes. Large, fluffy LDL particles are far less dangerous than small, dense ones. And guess what? Saturated fat tends to raise the larger, less harmful LDL particles, while refined carbohydrates and sugars increase the small, dense particles that are strongly linked to heart disease. This distinction was completely ignored for decades. Even more surprising, when people replaced saturated fat with refined carbohydrates, white bread, sugar-processed cereals, heart disease risk often increased, not decreased. That swap, encouraged for years, may have done more harm than good. New meta-analyses also show that replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fats from whole foods can reduce heart disease risk, but replacing it with processed vegetable oils or sugars doesn't deliver the same benefit. Context matters. Food quality matters. Another overlooked factor is inflammation. Heart disease is not just about cholesterol, it's a chronic inflammatory condition. Diets high in sugar, ultra-processed foods, and seed oils exposed to high heat contribute heavily to inflammation. Saturated fat, especially from whole foods, does not appear to be a primary driver of this process. Let's talk about real foods for a moment. Saturated fat exists in eggs, dairy, meat, coconut, and even dark chocolate. These foods also contain fat-soluble vitamins, minerals, and compounds that support hormone health, brain function, and satiety. When people remove these foods, they often replace them with products that look healthy on the label but are metabolically damaging. And this leads to another uncomfortable truth revealed by newer data. Low-fat diets are not inherently hot. In many long-term trials, people on low-fat diets did not experience significantly fewer heart events compared to those consuming moderate amounts of saturated fat from whole foods. What matters more is what replaces the fat. This is the part that was missing from public messaging for decades. The newest meta-analyses don't say saturated fat is harmless in unlimited amounts, but they clearly show it is not the standalone villain it was made out to be. The danger lies in ultra-processed foods, excess sugar, metabolic dysfunction, insulin resistance, and chronic inflammation, not a pat of butter by itself. And here's where things start to get even more interesting. Because not all saturated fats behave the same way in the body, and not all people respond to them the same way. Genetics, gut health, activity levels, and overall diet pattern change the outcome dramatically. One of the biggest mistakes nutrition science made was treating all saturated fat as if it were one single substance. In reality, saturated fats are a family of different fatty acids, each behaving differently inside the body. Some are rapidly used for energy, some support gut health. Others play structural roles in cell membranes and hormones. Lumping them together oversimplified a very complex biological system. For example, stearic acid, found in foods like dark chocolate and grass-fed beef, has been shown to have a neutral or even beneficial effect on cholesterol balance. It doesn't raise LDL the same way other fats might. Medium-chain saturated fats, like those in coconut oil, are quickly burned for energy and are far less likely to be stored as body fat. They even increase metabolic rate slightly in some people. Then there's dairy fat. Multiple large population studies show that full-fat dairy consumption is associated with lower risk of type 2 diabetes and, in some cases, lower cardiovascular risk. That result shocked researchers because dairy is rich in saturated fat. The explanation: dairy fat contains unique fatty acids that improve insulin sensitivity and reduce inflammation. This brings us to an uncomfortable but crucial point. The food matrix matters. Saturated fat doesn't act alone. It comes packaged with proteins, minerals, vitamins, and bioactive compounds. Butter from grass-fed cows is not the same as saturated fat isolated in a lab. Cheese is not the same as a processed frozen meal. When researchers analyze diets instead of nutrients in isolation, a clearer picture emerges. Traditional diets around the world, Mediterranean, French, Nordic, even some Asian diets contain significant saturated fat, yet historically showed low rates of heart disease. What they didn't contain was ultra-processed food, refined sugar, and industrial seed oils. This is where modern meta-analyses quietly flip the old narrative on its head. When saturated fat is consumed within a whole food diet, heart disease risk does not rise in a predictable way. But when saturated fat is consumed alongside refined carbs, sugary drinks, and constant snacking, metabolic damage increases. It's not the fat alone, it's the combination. Another overlooked factor is insulin. High insulin levels trap fat inside fat cells and promote arterial damage. Diets that severely restrict fat often increase carbohydrate intake, keeping insulin elevated all day. Ironically, this hormonal environment is far more dangerous for the heart than moderate saturated fat intake. There's also the role of triglycerides and HDL cholesterol. Saturated fat tends to raise HDL, the so-called good cholesterol, and lower triglycerides when carbs are controlled. This improves the triglyceride to HDL ratio, one of the strongest predictors of cardiovascular risk. Yet this marker was rarely discussed in early dietary guidelines. So why hasn't public advice caught up? Part of the answer is institutional inertia. Once guidelines are established, changing them requires admitting that earlier recommendations may have been incomplete or wrong. That's difficult for large organizations. Another reason is fear. Saturated fat became an easy villain, simple, memorable, and marketable. Meanwhile, food companies rushed in with heart-healthy alternatives. Margarines, low-fat yogurts, breakfast cereals fortified with vitamins but loaded with sugar. These products thrived under the low-fat narrative, even as metabolic disease increased. Modern meta-analyses don't say, eat unlimited saturated fat. What they say is more nuanced and far more useful. Saturated fat is not inherently dangerous. Its impact depends on food quality, overall diet, metabolic health, and what replaces it. This is why two people can eat the same amount of saturated fat and have completely different outcomes. One person, insulin sensitive and physically active, eating whole foods, may see no negative effects at all. Another, insulin resistant and living on processed carbs, may experience worsening markers. The real enemy isn't a nutrient. It's metabolic dysfunction. And this leads to the most important question of all. If saturated fat isn't the main culprit, what should people actually focus on to protect their heart? So, if the truth about saturated fat is more complex than we were told, how should this actually change the way you eat? The newest research points to a shift away from rigid rules and toward context-aware nutrition. Instead of asking, is saturated fat bad? The better question is, bad compared to what, and for whom? When saturated fat replaces refined carbohydrates and sugar, markers of metabolic health often improve. Blood triglycerides drop, HDL cholesterol rises, blood sugar becomes more stable, inflammation markers may decrease. This is why many people see improvements in their labs when they move away from low fat, high-carb diets toward whole food diets that include natural fats. But when saturated fat replaces unsaturated fats from whole foods like olive oil, nuts, seeds, and fatty fish, the picture is different. Some studies suggest that polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fats offer additional cardiovascular benefits, especially for people with existing insulin resistance or heart disease risk. That doesn't make saturated fat dangerous. It simply means balance matters. Another critical factor is metabolic health status. Someone with obesity, fatty liver disease, or poorly controlled diabetes may respond differently to saturated fat than someone metabolically healthy. In these cases, total calorie balance, carbohydrate quality, and insulin control matter more than fat type alone. Then there's genetics. Some people are hyperresponders to saturated fat, meaning their LDL cholesterol rises more than average. But even here, newer research shows LDL particle size, inflammation, and insulin levels matter more than LDL alone. A rise in LDL without inflammation does not carry the same risk profile as a rise alongside metabolic dysfunction. This is why modern cardiology is slowly moving away from single-number fear metrics and toward risk patterns. The question is no longer, is LDL higher, but is the body inflamed? Is insulin elevated? Are triglycerides high? Is HDL low? Saturated fat interacts with all of these differently depending on the person and the diet. Perhaps the biggest takeaway from new meta-analyses is this. Saturated fat is not a disease-causing agent on its own. It does not magically clog arteries. It does not act independently of hormones, food quality, or lifestyle. The body does not operate in isolation, and nutrition science cannot either. What truly drives heart disease risk appears to be a combination of chronic inflammation, insulin resistance, oxidative stress, and ultra-processed food exposure. Saturated fat, when eaten as part of whole foods, does not reliably worsen these conditions, and in some cases may even help stabilize them. This reframes decades of advice. It means that butter is not the same as sugar. Cheese is not the same as soda. A steak with vegetables is not metabolically equivalent to a low-fat muffin made of refined flour and seed oils. The real danger lies in dietary dogma, in oversimplified messages that ignore biology. When people fear fat, they often replace it with foods that quietly do more harm. The rise of low-fat products coincided with rising rates of obesity and diabetes, not their decline. So the truth about saturated fat isn't that it's a superfood or a poison. It's that it's neutral to context dependent and far less important than we were led to believe. What matters most is food quality, metabolic health, and long-term dietary patterns. And maybe the most important lesson of all is this: nutrition science evolves. What sounds certain today may be questioned tomorrow. The goal isn't to defend old beliefs, it is to follow the evidence wherever it leads. Which raises one final question that ties everything together. So, after decades of fear, confusion, and rigid rules, the real truth about saturated fat is finally coming into focus, and it is very different from what most people were taught. Saturated fat was never the lone villain. It was turned into one because nutrition science once needed a simple story, a single enemy, a clear target. But the human body is not simple, and disease is never caused by one nutrient acting alone. What the newest meta-analyses and long-term studies are telling us is this: heart disease does not begin with butter or eggs. It begins with chronic inflammation, insulin resistance, metabolic dysfunction, poor sleep, constant stress, and years of ultra-processed food exposure. Saturated fat, especially when eaten in real whole foods, is not the driver of that process. When people replaced saturated fat with refined carbohydrates, sugar, and industrial seed oils, health did not improve. In many cases, it got worse. Waistlines expanded, blood sugar rose, diabetes rates exploded. And yet, saturated fat continued to take the blame. That doesn't mean everyone should eat unlimited amounts of it. It means we should stop treating it like poison and start treating nutrition with nuance. Balance matters. Food quality matters. Your metabolic health matters. Your lifestyle matters far more than one line on a nutrition label. The biggest mistake of the past wasn't eating saturated fat. It was ignoring the bigger picture. The body responds to patterns, not isolated nutrients. It responds to how often insulin spikes, how inflamed tissues become, how well cells can repair, and how consistently real food is eaten over time. If there's one lesson to carry forward, it's this: fear-based nutrition advice rarely leads to health. Understanding does. So instead of asking whether saturated fat is good or bad, ask better questions. What foods are you eating it with? How processed is your overall diet? Are you metabolically healthy? Are you sleeping well, managing stress, and moving your body? Because when those foundations are strong, saturated fat loses its power to scare, and you regain the power to make informed choices. Nutrition science didn't fail us by changing its mind. It failed us by pretending it had all the answers too early. Now, with better data and better tools, we finally get to see the full picture. And that truth is far more freeing than fear ever was.